This video will provide a brief introduction to the endocrine system. Before I get into details on the endocrine system, I just want to mention a few things about cellular communication. The activities carried on by the cells throughout your body are coordinated by various types of mechanisms that allow one cell to communicate with another, whether those cells are close by or far apart. The language of cellular communication is chemistry, ions and small and large molecules being transferred from one cell to the other to cause a particular change. For example, very small molecules, even ions, can move from one cell directly to another through something called a gap junction. This is kind of like a tunnel between two cells that are adjoining, and it allows these very small molecules to move without having to go through the cell membrane. Then for cells that are in the same general area, we have larger molecules that are known as paracrine factors that actually can move out of one cell, slide through the extracellular fluid that's in between your body cells to reach other cells in the same general area. When this chemical language is coming from outside of a cell, the cells that receive it have to have the receptor that can bind and pick up with that particular type of molecule. The endocrine system focuses on hormones that move through the bloodstream to cells often in vastly different parts of the body. And again, these cells need to have the appropriate receptors. And then in the nervous system, we talked about how neurotransmitters are chemicals that move across nerve synapses to pass on the nervous impulse from one neuron to another. The overall goal of all of this communication is to preserve homeostasis, to keep everything in balance within an organism so the organism can survive. Here are just some illustrations showing these different types of different levels of communication. Here is a very close communication between two cells that are adjacent, or here we have the communication molecules moving through interstitial fluid, in the endocrine system moving through the bloodstream, and then of course the nervous system going across the synapse. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the nervous system. How does it compare to the endocrine system? Both systems are involved in communication, but they go about it in very different ways. The nervous system, remember, uses electrical impulses down a neuron and then chemical neurotransmitters across the synapse to provide rapid, short-term, precise messages that usually deal with some kind of crisis management. So a nervous system message can be thought of as a direct message from one cell to another, or from one cell to a muscle or to a gland. In comparison, the endocrine system uses chemical hormones for a slower, long-term metabolic change, which usually affect more than one organ. You can think of the endocrine system as putting out a general broadcast, and all the cells with the correct receivers or the receptors will be able to pick up the message. When we talk about the endocrine system, we're going to be talking about glands, and glands are tissues that both produce and then secrete or send it out of the cell a particular substance. We're focusing on endocrine glands in this system, and these are the ones that secrete hormones into the bloodstream to reach target cells far away. Paracrine glands are the ones that secrete hormones for the nearby cells that it moves through the interstitial fluid or the extracellular fluid. And we've already mentioned exocrine glands, which have ducts, like your sweat glands, that deliver their products directly to a specific site. The endocrine system is all about hormones. There are over 50 different hormones that circulate throughout the human body throughout your life, and they do a variety of different things, but we can think of them as basically being the substances that regulate the metabolic processes in our cells. Metabolic processes, of course, are all those chemical reactions that make life possible. Hormones control the rate of these chemical reactions. They turn them on and turn them off. They can change how the cell membrane responds to move substances into or out of cells more quickly or more slowly. Hormones maintain our water and electrolyte balance by controlling the amount and composition of the different body fluids. And hormones trigger big events in cells. They start mitosis or transcription of a gene and then translation into make a particular protein. Most of the work of hormones is happening on the cellular level, but there also are some whole body processes that will be influenced by hormones, such as the heart rate or whether your blood vessels are constricted or dilated. And these two things together work to affect your blood pressure. You would be unable to survive without hormones. They are so much more than just the sexual hormones that we tend to think about when somebody says the word hormones. Hormones come in two different classifications. There's two different categories, and it's all about what they're made out of. There are hormones that are steroid hormones or steroid-like, and they are basically made around cholesterol. Cholesterol is a ringed substance. You can see the illustration of cholesterol down here, but it is something your body makes naturally. You can get it from food, but you can make everything you need as long as you have the basic raw ingredients. The steroid hormones make up our sex hormones, the things that promote sexual development and maintain things like pregnancy, and also the hormones that come from the adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands are found on top of your kidneys. The cortex is the outer layer of that. Steroid hormones are lipids, and so because they are lipids, they can pass through the cell membrane directly into the cell or slide even through the nuclear membrane into the nucleus because the lipid nature of their structure allows them to move through that phospholipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane. And then we have the non-steroid hormones that are protein-based. They're either proteins or amino acid molecules. They may go by names such as amines or peptides or glycoproteins. And they cannot pass through the cell membrane because they are more water-based. They will be rejected by the phospholipid bilayer. And so they need a receptor on the cell membrane to connect to in order to do their job. Just looking in a little more detail on what happens with these hormones, a steroid hormone then will enter the cell because it can move through the cell membrane, and it binds with a receptor inside the cell. This receptor carries it into the nucleus and then is able to trigger transcription of certain genes to then promote the synthesis of particular proteins that then would cause a certain change in the body. For example, sex hormones, I'm sure you can imagine think about the effect of sex hormones on the development of secondary sex characteristics. These hormones kick in puberty, and you see a lot of bodily changes, both in male and female, because of the effect on what genes are being transcribed and then translated into proteins and how it changes what's happening in the body. Non-steroid hormones, remember, cannot move through the cell membrane, and so they have to bind on the cell membrane with a receptor. And then this binding triggers what's known as a cascade of responses. It triggers a bunch of different things happening inside the cell. In fact, sometimes a single hormone binding to the outside of a cell has a large response. We call it a one-to-many response. Insulin is a perfect example of a non-steroid hormone. It binds to the cell membrane, and this triggers the movement of glucose transporters, which are structures that are inside the cell until insulin is on the receptor. Once it's on the receptor, those glucose transporters are carried to the cell membrane where they are able to pick up the glucose that is present outside the cell and bring it into the cell. And then when the insulin is no longer available, the glucose transporters move back into the cell. They're no longer available to pick up the glucose. Hormones in your body are controlled by negative feedback loops. Remember, negative feedback is a mechanism that turns off the process whenever balance is restored in whatever homeostasis process we're talking about. So here's a little illustration of this negative feedback in loop in effect in controlling blood glucose levels. It would start when you consume some food, and so the food will be digested and glucose will move into the blood. And when a particular concentration is reached, in this case greater than 5 millimoles per liter, then this is a trigger to the pancreas to let insulin be released in order to deal with this elevated blood glucose. Insulin, as I've already mentioned, binds to the cells, brings the glucose transporter molecules up to the surface of the cell membrane. The glucose is taken from the bloodstream, brought into cells, causing a decrease in blood glucose. Once it falls below 4 or so millimoles per liter, then the trigger to the pancreas is to shut down insulin secretion until the blood glucose levels increase again. So this is a negative feedback loop. The process is turned on as the glucose goes up, and it is turned off when the glucose levels go down. This control of hormones comes actually from 3 different areas. The majority of your hormonal control is coming from the brain, from the part of the brain known as the hypothalamus. Remember, this is in the diencephalon, sort of in the center of the brain. And the hypothalamus is monitoring the body's internal environment and then releasing various hormone-releasing factors, other chemicals that travel to a particular gland and tell that gland to release the hormone in order to do the whatever process needs to happen in order to maintain homeostasis. But your nervous system also has some motor nerves going directly to glands, and so your nervous system can stimulate the gland to release the hormone. And there are certain glands, like the parathyroid gland, that's involved in monitoring the amount of calcium in the blood, that actually does all the work itself. It self-monitors the concentration of calcium, to use this one for an example, and then the change in concentration will stimulate production and release if blood calcium levels go too low. The major endocrine glands will be talked about in detail in another video, but I just wanted to point them out. The most important endocrine glands, of course, are the hypothalamus. So along with producing these releasing factors, the hypothalamus actually produces a number of hormones itself and sends them on to the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland, part of the pituitary gland, is taking in the hormones produced by the hypothalamus and storing them. There are other parts of the pituitary gland that also produce hormones. Another major endocrine gland is the thyroid gland that's got a very important role in maintaining cellular respiration, and there's sort of your metabolic rate. Then there's the adrenal gland that I already mentioned that sits on top of the kidneys, and the pancreas. So these are sort of your major endocrine glands, but these other glands on here also have a role in producing hormones. The thymus is involved in producing hormones that mature particular white blood cells. Of course, you are familiar with the roles of the ovary and the testes in producing the hormones that maintain the secondary sex characteristics for males and females. The kidney produces hormones that are related to red blood cell production. The parathyroid gland I already mentioned is part of the thyroid gland that's involved in blood calcium levels. And the pineal gland we had mentioned when we studied the brain because it produces melatonin. You'll learn a lot more about these glands and the hormones that they produce as we move through this course. So check for understanding. Can you identify the key characteristics of the endocrine system, especially how it compares to the nervous system? Can you explain how hormones are classified based on their chemical structure and how that affects how they can interact with target cells? Can you explain how the release of hormones is controlled by our bodies? And can you name these major organs of the endocrine system? If you're not sure how to answer any of these questions, go back and listen again to the video.